Welcome to the Bookman's Corner. I'm Lois Lindstrom. Our guest today is author Jamie MacVicar, who was on the final list for the Marfield Prize for Arts Writing. He is the co-author of Cross Pens, a humorous book of letters among three men. He resides in Washington, D.C., and was the president of an awards-winning communications firm. His latest work, which took 17 years of research and writing, is titled The Advance Man, A Journey into the World of the Circus. There has never been a book from an advanced man's perspective, and Jamie learned it from the masters. He learned the craft, which in many ways laid the foundation of event marketing today. And his book is an inside look into an American icon, Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. Also, all the advertising and promotion that is discussed in this unique book happened before there were cell phones and the internet. Jamie, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
So, the title of your book, Advance Man, what does that mean and how did you get that job?
Well, when you think about an advanced man, you think about the little children's books of the cigar-smoking, portly gentleman hanging up the posters on the tree shouting, "The circus is coming." But when I did it, fresh out of college in 1974,
1974, okay.
we employed the modern day techniques and things that really even today would be almost considered secretive, ways in which we stretched our advertising dollars. But our job was to come into a town often 8 to 12 weeks before the circus arrived, usually doing 2 cities at a time, and fill every seat.
Wow. And how many seats were we talking about? Like, were there thousands of seats to be filled, or, I mean?
Yeah, these arenas would run anywhere from 12,000, might have been the smallest, to as many as 20,000 seats, depending on the size of the city. And also, depending on the size of the city, would determine the length of the run. For example, we played New York for 6 straight weeks.
Okay.
On the same token, I went down to Savannah, Georgia, opened on a matinee, and there were only 4 performances.
Okay.
So we would try to estimate, what the right marketing mix was in terms of number of performances.
Now it's changed, hasn't it? It's not as prolific of an entertainment for Americans.
It's an interesting question. In many ways, the actual performance is the same. The old-time circuses of the animal acts and the clowns and the showgirls. What's changed is the proliferation of different types of entertainment. And if I can take you back in time for just a little bit, because in many ways, modern times, although it's eradicated much of our discomforts, it's also eradicated much of our sensory perceptions. And there were hundreds of tent shows that were crisscrossing the country at the turn of the century. And it wasn't just the circus. Minstrel shows, opera companies, theatrical groups. Chances are, if you were an entertainer, you'd perform underneath a canvas tent. But nothing could remotely compare to the arrival of the circus. And the reason, very quickly, was that the circus was a window to the world when there was just a thirst for knowledge.
Right.
It was the precursor to the modern zoo. Its sideshows exhibited the modern day inventions, the phonograph, the sewing machine, the telephone. And
it was like a World Expo in a way.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it was a National Geographic. Perhaps Aborigine women with stretched out and elongated lips. And if they didn't have the real thing, they weren't afraid to fabricate it.
Right.
So the circus was a very fascinating thing to come into town.
Now, the circus arrived by train, didn't it? Weren't all these animals in train cars going from point A to point B?
Only in the late 1800s. Prior to that, it arrived by wagons.
Okay.
And it was only the big circuses like Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey that was able to transfer to actual train cars. But for many, many years, it would be by wagons. And I remember the Ringling Brothers at one point writing their banker. Their wagons, before they went on train, had been mired in mud. They needed $1,000. It had not quit raining for 30 straight days.
The poor animals.
So yeah, you can only imagine what it was like.
Yes.
And I might add on this, because oftentimes the logistics isn't really discussed. James Bailey, the quartermaster for the German army, actually followed James Bailey around for a month just to see how he moved masses of men and animals.
Yeah.
All the logistics went with it because it required just such incredible
timing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Incredible. And well, of course, today the times are so different now with the internet. With all the blogs people have and all the accessible entertainment, but is there anything that we've lost? That this feeling of that the town spirit and the circus coming to town, it's not there anymore, is it?
Well, you know, it's kind of funny. Paul Bowles, one of my favorite authors, he wrote A Sheltering Sky, said that if you went back in time, people were kibitzing in the streets. It was life going on, not by. And in many ways, that's what I think has contracted here in the modern world. It's cars whizzing by, the sense of community. But if you look at the pictures, the old pictures prior to the television age, there were crowds in front of the Sideshow Barker, crowds in front of Houdini, who was hanging off of a chain. People did things together. But I think there was another thing that's missing today, and that's anticipation. And I can remember as a little boy when a carnival or the circus was coming into
So
town.
exciting.
I would save my newspaper route money for weeks.
That's right. You had to be there. That's
yeah.
right.
So on one hand today, you can't possibly be bored, but on the other hand, that sense of participating with other people in something you looked forward to, I think is gone. I think it's missing. And I think that's a lot.
Well, you know, most people don't realize that it was late in life that P.T. Barnum became involved in the circus. What had he done before, and what drove him to become involved in a circus?
Yeah. 2010 was the 200-year anniversary of P.T. Barnum's birth. And what he had done was he owned the American Museum just south of City Hall in New York, which he ran for
in New York City, in Manhattan, right?
Which he ran for 30 years. And these types of museums, he was one of many museum owners dotted around the country in many of the major cities, but it was filled with treasures that he collected from around the world. But it was also where he exhibited the likes of Cheng and Eng, the Siamese twins, the wild men of Borneo, the flesh-eating cannibal. Now, I might add, the wild men of Borneo captured off the shores were actually two mentally challenged young men who grew up in a farm in Ohio.
Oh dear.
And the flesh-eating cannibal had been a former maid in Virginia. But anyway, the museum was the perfect precursor to his later years, because he would take these acts abroad, like Tom Thumb and things, to when at the age of 60, he became involved with the circus. And I think it was a combination of things. His museum had burned down twice. He had retired from the museum, and suddenly the opportunity to loan its name to the enterprise came up. But what the people didn't realize is how involved he would become.
Yes, and his name is so identified with the circus. Barnum's partner, James Bailey, I understand, was a very different type of person. How so?
Couldn't have been more opposite. Whereas P.T. Barnum loved the press, and he was a promoter and an extreme extrovert, Bailey was the absolute opposite. He wore a derby hat to hide his baldness. If there were journalists around, he would hide in the wagon. He had a nervous twitch. And he had a temper sometimes that was even unpredictable. And like I said, he was in charge of the mechanics, the logistics, but a completely opposite personality. But they complemented each other very well.
And would you say that Bailey was probably more of a businessman than Barnum? I mean, was he more interested in the income from the ticket sales and more of an administrator?
Well, in that regard, as far as the businessman aspect, they were equals.
Okay.
It was merely that it's almost like a right brain versus a left brain. One was the promoter, and one was more involved in the technical aspects of putting the show together and moving it. But Bailey, when he was in his late teens, had run away and joined a circus. And it was called the Cooper and Bailey Circus. And Bailey made himself indispensable. So much so that when Bailey died, he demanded a full partnership. Cooper would not give it to him, so Bailey simply changed his own name. His name had been McGinnis, and he changed it to Bailey. And he ran the Allied shows and his own circus for years before even meeting Barnum. So they were both businessmen. And then long after Barnum died, Bailey continued to run this colossal circus that they had put together.
Right. You know, the Ringling Brothers did run a powerful enterprise, and they, in the end, Barnum and Bailey Circus became the most dominant circus in the world. I mean, this circus then traveled internationally, right?
Right. It did. It did.
Did they have like several that were traveling internationally, and then several that were traveling in the States? And
well, even today, you had to be huge. These huge circuses would dominate the locations and the sites when they'd move into the cities, so that in a way, bigness perpetuated itself and the smaller circuses couldn't compete as strongly. But the Ringling Brothers, there were 6 of them that had all joined forces together. And somebody once said the problem with the Ringling Brothers is there's just so many of them. So you had them on one hand. Then you had the famous P.T. Barnum and all he could bring combined with Bailey. And Barnum died first, and then Bailey passed away. He was from erysipelas.
What year would that be?
I forget the year. It was the late 1800s, but it was probably from a mosquito bite from one of his horses. And he wasn't that old. He was only in his early 60s at this point. His wife tried to continue Barnum and Bailey, but it was just too much. And then at that point, the Ringling Brothers bought them out, and that's how they came to dominate.
In the 1960s, Irvin Feld took over, but not before going bankrupt, right? I mean, they had all kinds of ups and downs in the business, right?
Well, it was a combination of things. You had the Great Circus Fire in Hartford, Connecticut, in which 168 people, many of them were children, died.
What year was that?
That was, I believe, in 1943, but I'm not positive now. But you had the Hartford Circus. And by the time they were through, the lawsuits totaled over $5 million.
Whoa.
The only thing that saved Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey were the royalties from Cecil B. DeMille's movie, which was extremely popular in the early 50s, called The Greatest Show on Earth. That and the combination of the enormous cost of traveling with the tents and all the things that we did, and these indoor arenas were popping up. So the show had declared bankruptcy. And that was the point when Irvin Feld, who dreamed of owning the circus, was able to come in and leverage the buy from John Ringling North.
Well, in your book, you describe the distrust that existed between the circus and the box office. I mean, what was the basis for this distrust?
Well, it had a pretty rich history, and I'll give you the answer from both perspectives. From the box office side, people would actually pay for the privilege, to circus owners, for the privilege of selling tickets so that they could change the customers. And then from the circus side, there was an expression called making your nut. And we would often ask each other as fellow promoters, did you make your nut? Well, what that meant was, did you make your sales projection? But where that came from is when the circuses would come into town, the sheriff would promptly come out and confiscate the axle nuts off of the circus wagons so they couldn't leave before they paid all their bills.
Really?
Right.
Wow.
But even when I joined the circus, you had to watch doors. And I can remember standing there staring at the ticket taker and wondering, what am I supposed to be looking for? When my boss said, you're looking for collusion, he could tear off, of course it's all electronic now, but at that time, the ticket taker could tear off part of the stub, the kid stub. It was worth $1, turn it into the box office. They could split the proceeds. So we were always kind of eyeing each other warily.
How did your experience as an advance man differ from the circus advance man in earlier times? Well, how is it different in the 70s, like from the 1800s, let's say? How was it different?
Well, I think if you went back in time, there are a few things that they did that we didn't. Number one, they did site selections, and that wasn't really my job. We were playing in major arenas that had already been selected by a particular department. But the advancement in the old days was actually come in and negotiate the sites. And often they would communicate with each other and cooperate so that they weren't competing. But the advance man back then sold tickets by drawing crowds. And so he had to be much more out front than we were. And some of the ways they did that was the old circus parades, the musical wagons that would come down, and then all the farm workers would come in from the fields to gather and listen. He would be concerned about things like harvesting time when there were plentiful workers and they had money in their pocket. They might put on a high wire act across the center of town, and even band members were hired as much for their athletic ability as their musical talent, because they would challenge local baseball teams for a game of baseball. Anything to gather crowds where he could literally hand sell the tickets.
The whole job was to make the crowds interested in buying tickets, right?
You got it. Whereas in my time, suddenly we were into mass communications of radio and television and co-promotions, which we'll talk a little bit about in a minute.
Well, that's my next question, because one of your Amazon customer reviews stated that your book should be required reading by every advertising, marketing, and communications class in America. And I did find it fascinating how you were selling advertising related to giving away tickets and getting stories in the newspapers about the circus. I mean, it was all tit for tat kind of thing. Talk about that.
Yeah. What was unique about what we did? It wasn't necessarily our media buying abilities, although there we were quite savvy. It wasn't necessarily our creative art, although there was award-winning art. What our ability was to be able to multiply the advertising dollars. If I went into a city with $50,000 cash I could spend, by the time I was through, I'd have $500,000 worth of advertising.
Wow.
And publicity.
That's good knowledge. That a lot of people would like to have that knowledge.
Well, they would, and especially in a troubled economy like today,
yes.
where people need to spread their advertising dollars. And even when I think of emerging economies in Eastern Europe and China and India, I would love for them to know how we did it. And I did it two ways.
Okay.
Number one, when I would approach the media, say a radio station, I would do a half cash, half trade, and a promotion, and that tripled my dollars. For example, I would go in and say, look, I would like to give you $5,000, buy 10 spots a day for 2 weeks. Drive time, of course.
Is this radio?
This would be a radio station, for example, but I could do this with almost any media. Then I would like to trade you an equal number of matinee seats, another $5,000 worth of tickets, seats that I probably wouldn't fill anyway, for another 10 spots a day for 2 weeks. Drive time, thanks. But then thirdly, now that you have this block of 500 tickets, I'd like you to give them over the air in a special promotion. And it just so happens, here's a few that I can suggest to you.
Exactly. Okay. So that's wonderful.
So number one was that's the way we would do it with the medium. Number two, and this didn't cost me anything at all, I would approach people that had a large advertising budget. For example, you might wonder, well, what would Safeway and Ringling Brothers Circus have in common?
Yes.
Well, I would go to Safeway and say, how would you like to have Safeway night at the circus? We're going to let you have an honorary ringmaster. We're going to let you have some VIP seats. And I'm going to give you $2,002 off discount matinee tickets or weeknight tickets that you can stuff into the grocery bags, and you can advertise to anyone who comes into Safeway over this block of time.
It was a no-brainer, right?
Gets a $2 off coupon. Now, I am only too happy to sell a matinee seat at 20% off.
Right.
But in turn, they snipe all of their advertising by adding Ringling's full dates on their newspapers. The posters go up in all of their windows. Easel backs go on the counters, et cetera, et cetera. And so many people today, if they thought about it, could link up with others and find those synergisms that we found. And I would do this 20 and 30 times. To give you another example, I might go to a car dealer and say, how about a special promotion where in your advertising you give away a family of tickets for everybody who test drives a car. Costs me nothing. But he has thousands of dollars worth of advertising, and over a period of time he promotes it. And we had dozens of these, and I bring them up in the book.
Yes, it's fascinating to read it. And then I thought that also, in reading your book, and I realized you were just starting out here in the 70s, that you had an immediate supervisor who was a good mentor, but he had a really tough approach. Would you recommend that type of management to a young adult today?
Maybe if they join the Marines.
That's right. He was a really tough boss.
Well, I had some pretty good experience. I'd been in the ROTC, and my father was a pretty tough customer. So by the time I met him, I was somewhat used to a bullyish nature. But you know what they really wanted to do was weed you out. Because they're making an investment in you, and very, very few people would last very long, literally living on the road from one hotel to the other. And this was just a no-nonsense outfit, and they wanted to find out whether you were going to cut it real quick.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, and also referring to today's media venues and strategies, an event promoter remarked after reading your book, "Bring on the new and the old."
Right.
What did he mean by that?
Well, there's been an awful lot of talk these last couple of years about marketing through social media, and Google, and some of these types of things.
Facebook.
And Facebook. And I'm not a humongous proponent of those necessarily, and I think this is where he was coming from. And when I say the old media, we're talking about newspapers and magazines and radio and TV. But every one of the old media has an ability to capture you in that moment. If you're watching television and you've got a 30-second spot, it's got music and sound, and if it's done creatively, you're probably going to hear it.
That's right.
If I bought a print ad, I would always request that it be next to editorials. Pretty hard to miss if you're reading something next to it. But I don't know about you, but I find if I go to a website, my mind has already been trained to completely eliminate any advertising. I don't even look for it. Now, if you're using it as a catalog, that's different, but I don't necessarily see it as the best way to grab your customer. I mean, fundamentally, you still have creative impact, reach, and frequency, and those are the three principles that have never ended, and you need to choose the media that's going to deliver that.
Your job was not just a job, it was a life. I mean, you would move into a city for weeks before the show arrived, and you got to meet all the citizens of the town and interact with them. I mean, what was that lifestyle like?
Well, you know, it's kind of funny. I can remember when I was training under Art Ricker in California, and I was just so excited. I'd been working with the advanced clown who came in for publicity, and we had a publicity person, and he sat next to the pool one evening, and he said, well, Jamie, wait till you're all alone. It's a whole different story then. And you know, especially at that age in your early 20s, when other people kind of define your identity, to suddenly, suitcase in hand, walk into, say, Savannah, Georgia, and we were being paid a pittance. I can remember staying in the Alamo Hotel for $11 a night. I shudder just to remember it, or the Piccadilly Inn.
That's right.
And then suddenly you were there, and there was no Facebook, there were no cell phones, there wasn't the structure today that kind of exists. And it was twofold. On one hand, at this young age, you had the excitement of a complete budget and all the flexibility to do what you love to do, and I did love the job. But then on the other hand, I can remember sitting on a park bench in the middle of a city one time, and literally having not spoken to another soul for 4 days.
Ooh.
And on this sort of cloudy, somber day, breaking down in tears out of just pure loneliness.
You were very isolated, weren't you?
Very isolated.
Yeah. Ooh. But as an advanced man, you were sometimes thrown into the world of celebrities. Can you give us a couple of celebrity stories?
Well, Cary Grant comes to mind.
Cary Grant, okay. And what town is this? Is this Hollywood?
I was in Los Angeles. I was doing the Los Angeles Forum, and the phone rang. They said, hello, this is Cary Grant. And I took a double take. Did you say Cary Grant? He said, I wonder if you could do me a favor. He said, I'd like to come by and bring my kids to the circus, but I didn't really want to mess with photographers and all that. Could you meet me in the back? So I said, absolutely.
Yes.
So I arranged for him to come in one of the back parking lots, and I was standing there, and the station wagon comes up, and there's Cary Grant. And he comes out, and he has somebody that assists with the kids. Kids are about 8 or 10 years old. Now, Cary Grant's about 70 at this time. But I'll tell you what impressed me. I'm 6'1", and it felt as though he towered over me.
Really? So
this is a big man
tall.
with shoulders about this broad, probably weighed 220 pounds, and 6'3", 6'4". And a really nice gentleman. Anyway, I brought him in. Photographers noticed him anyway. Ladies would run up and give him a kiss on the cheek, and he would just kind of laugh about it. Well, anyway, he leaves. I go to my supervisor, and I said, you won't believe who I met this afternoon. Cary Grant called. Well, my supervisor said kind of cynically, what did he want? Free tickets? And I was insulted.
I bet.
But it was early in the next morning when I realized that he had indeed gotten in for free.
Of course.
So
well, yes, Cary Grant. I mean, well, can you describe some of the promotional events that did not go as planned?
Oh, there were more than one. One that comes in mind. I was in Cleveland at the time, and I'd just run out of promotional ideas. I'd set up 20 different promotions with radio stations, but one popular radio station said, well, we have a client that has a camera. Is there anything that you can do with that? So I thought about it, and I said, well, why don't we do this? At intermission, anybody who's brought that camera to the show, they can come down, and Gunther Gebel-Williams, the star of the show, will have a showgirl and an elephant and him out there, and they can come down and take pictures. Well, anyway, the night of the show comes, we make that announcement, and nobody moves.
Really?
Here I've got Gunther Gebel-Williams put in this humiliating position, and then suddenly a father stands up, and then suddenly another row, and then suddenly 10,000 people. They're practically swinging off the rigging. The ringmaster is fit to be tied.
Yeah.
The security officers, who have had nothing to do all week, have got their billy clubs out trying to get the people. It was an absolute nightmare.
Whoa,
So
whoa.
that was an example.
Well, there are, of course, big stresses in being in a small town promoting an upcoming show, right? It's just,
Right.
I found it interesting about the fact that you led animals through an 8-mile walk, and that was just, what was that like? An 8-mile walk through, what city was that? That was
I was in Evansville, Indiana.
Evansville, Indiana. Yeah.
I was in Indiana. We always had the train has to stop somewhere, and we have to get the animals from the train to the building. And so our view was, why not get some publicity from this? And we would usually invite the press. In that one particular case, I went overboard and rerouted it. It was only about a mile to the building, and I routed it through town and residential neighborhoods. And I felt so guilty about it that I walked beside the elephants myself for those 8 miles.
The poor elephants, they must have been exhausted.
Well, the roustabouts weren't too happy with me either.
Well, I would like to know, and I'm sure our viewers would like to know, how can we find you?
It's available at Amazon. You can order it through any bookstore, so all the traditional methods. So,
And are you planning another book in the upcoming future?
you know, probably not.
Really? Because, I mean, 17 years of your life was spent with
Right.
this one, right?
Right. This was such a major project, and in so many ways, I tried to do something very original, which is not only teach a craft, but tell a very compelling story of what happens to this young man thrown into the middle of nowhere. And to write a memoir, it's the most challenging book to write. You have to learn how to become a historian, a biographer,
Yes.
a suspense writer. And I just put so much of what I'd learned through life into this book that I'm really content if I never write another one. On the same token, if a compelling story comes forward, never say never.
Well, this book is fabulous. I read it. I mean, it's 600 plus pages, but I have to say the final third of your book is really riveting, very, very intense. And I have to say, people should get the book because of that. And I hope that you're successful, and thank you so much for joining us. And welcome back to the next edition of the Bookman's Corner, a show devoted to authors and fascinating books.